I met the old man in a coffee house that smelled of tangerine peel and cigarette smoke. Tokyo was rebuilding itself into mirrors and neon, yet he wore a salt-bleached field cap and a watch repaired 3 times. He pressed 2 fingers to the table as if finding a map grid. People keep asking, he said, why we hated the Marines more than any other unit. Hated is the wrong word. The word was osor, a dread that crawled up the spine and stayed there even when you smiled. We learned it on Guadalcanal. His name was Sergeant Nakamura, 17th Army, Rifle Company. His English was careful. My tape recorder leaned toward him like a student. On maps, he said, Guadalcanal looked like a fish with a broken back. In our orders, it was a step stool, build an airstrip, leap to Port Moresby. In reality, it was sunstroke and jungle rot, rivers that argued with you, nights that watched you. And then the Marines came. He pinched his fingers together, measuring the distance of a rifle front sight. They landed and the tide did not go out. The first thing Nakamura noticed about the Marines was the noise. Not just guns, organization made sound. Ammo mules chuffing. Priests saying quick mass under palm trees. Engineers turning rusted drums into revetments. Axes chopping in rhythm. Radio code crackling like beetles. It produced a hum that suggested permanence. Japanese units, superb at night infiltration and bayonet work, were often light on logistics. On Guadalcanal, 1,000 details conspired to starve them. Marines, by contrast, built Henderson Field, named it after one of their own, and then swelled around it like a coral reef alive with teeth. Our officers sent us at night, Nakamura said. Bayonet charges, because we believe in the blade and darkness. But Marines laid their machine guns like carpenters lay joists. Their interlocking fields of fire were, how do you say, unsentimental. We were poetry, they were geometry. He laughed, a dry hinge turning. On the night of the Ilu River fight, Nakamura belly-crawled in a wash of rain and mud. Hear a sound like angry bees. It was .30 caliber fire sawing palm trunks. Behind it, the low bark of a weapon he'd never met before. Semi-automatic rifle fire, steady and unflinching. Marines carried a rifle that recovered almost as fast as a thought. Arisaka bolts had to be persuaded every time. Speed matters when darkness spits friends and strangers into the same 10 meters. Our charge broke, Nakamura admitted. Not because we were cowards, because we met a wall that could move. At dawn, the Cactus Air Force rose off Henderson like knives lifted from cutting board. Wildcats and Dauntless clawed the sky, and when the Zeros came, the Marines ducked, prayed, and adapted. They were not perfect. They bled, cursed, and argued with supply sergeants. But they learned in public. That unsettled the enemy most. The feeling you were fighting someone who was getting better while you were shrinking. What we feared, Nakamura said, was their method. Marines killed you with a sequence. Scout sniper to probe, mortar to pin, combined machine gun teams to canal AIs. Then something ugly. Flamethrower, satchel charges, bulldozer blade. If a bunker lived through that, an engineer would climb on top and find out why it still breathed. Hate. It is easy to hate a man with a flamethrower, but the dread came from realizing the flamethrower was only step 4. He cupped the coffee like a grenade he had chosen not to throw. Tarawa taught him what Marines would do for 100 meters of beach. He wasn't there. Few who saw that reef at low tide and the men dropping in waist-deep water forgot it. But every rumor moved through the islands faster than mail. At Tarawa, the Japanese boast that 1,000,000 men could not take it in 100 years was turned into a dead proverb in 76 hours. Marines waded forward into an arithmetic problem. Coral, tide, crossfire, maps that lied. They died in neat rows under sights they could not yet see. And still they came, pushing through water like it was a difficult chapter. After Tarawa, Nakamura said, we stopped treating them as naval infantry. We began calling them kaibatsu, sea monsters. He smiled at his own melodrama. We respected the U.S. Army too. On New Georgia and later on Leyte, they fought superbly. But the Marines brought the ocean with them. Their artillery floated. Their kitchens floated. Every lagoon was a drawbridge they could lower. When our bunkers silenced one wave, we would look up and see another wave already learning from the last. On Saipan, the dread matured into calculus. Japanese officers looked through slits at Marines doing things that were not in the manual. Coupling tanks nose to form movable fortresses. Calling dive bombers down to within 2 football fields of their own lines. Pulling Navajo code talkers into the net so fire support moved like gossip. They turned hills into lessons. If a cave system swallowed a platoon on Monday, by Wednesday the Marines returned with a flamethrower team, a demolitions man, a bar gunner who had patience, and a bulldozer whose driver sang as he worked. It wasn't brutality for its own sake. It was a doctrine: close, isolate, reduce. Many of us, Nakamura said softly, believed that surrender erased your name from the family record. So we held. But the Marines fought like men who intended to go home. That is a dangerous kind of courage, stubborn and sane. He pushed his cup away and drew a square in condensation. Here is a bunker, he said. Roof 1 meter of coral, embrasure like a shell slit. You and your 3 friends have water, a light machine gun, a bucket of grenades. You have memorized the killing lanes on the map. The Marines send riflemen. You chew them. They send a tank. You hit the track with a satchel charge. You celebrate. Then you hear it. The cough of a flamethrower as if someone is lighting a God's cigarette. Heat seeks corners. Air disappears. Your lungs ask you what plan you have after oxygen. That is when hatred is born. Not because the Marine is cruel, but because his method leaves your bravery nowhere to stand. He wiped the square away. What made Marines different? He counted on his fingers, each bent knuckle a chapter. Amphibious obsession. While the world blinked, they rehearsed landings on beaches nobody wanted to visit. They owned the ship-to-shore problem the way a locksmith owns locks. The first time they beached a Higgins boat, they were clumsy. The 5th time, dangerous. The 10th, inevitable. Small unit initiative. Corporals were permitted to decide. A fire team was a living organism, bar as beating heart. Japanese squads could be brilliant under a veteran NCO, but the culture demanded permission for improvisation. Shock lives in seconds. If you spend them asking a map for advice, a Marine corporal spends them solving you. Combined arms as a reflex. The radio net was a nerve system. Artillery, mortars, naval gunfire, and air were muscles twitching to it. A Japanese officer might have artillery. A Marine lieutenant had a menu. Logistics with a grin. They built a chow line under shell fire and argued about coffee. They dragged a refrigeration unit into a jungle where even wind had malaria. A fed Marine is a witty Marine. Witty men are hard to corner. Psychology. Marines cultivated a reputation for ferocity and then showed up early to meet it. They named hills after numbers and beaches after letters, reducing romance to coordinate. Your shrine to honorable death was a grid square to them. Clinical, unstoppable. But the last reason, Nakamura said, is difficult to translate. When a Marine died, the man next to him took his ammunition, not his last words. That sounds cruel, but it is loyalty of a terrible, beautiful kind. He promised to finish the task, and he did. He wrote the letter later. He fell silent. In the shop's window, rain threaded the neon into silk. Do I hate them now? He finally asked himself. No, I hate the waste. But when you ask, why do we dread fighting Marines? Remember this. We were fighting not just men, but a process tuned to our weaknesses. The Army could overwhelm us. The Marines could unriddle us. He tapped the table one last time, and they kept coming with the tide. He stood, paid for the coffee I should have paid for, and adjusted his old field cap as if saluting an invisible shoreline. Come tomorrow, he said at the door. I will tell you about Paliliu and the island that ate spring water like powder. After that, Iwo Jima, the bad dream no one wakes from quickly. There you will understand the final reason. He stepped into the drizzle. The bell over the door tinkled like shell casings cooling on coral. Part 2. Polileu, Iwo, and the final reason. The next afternoon, he waited for me with 2 items: a folded pencil sketch of a ridgeline and a pebble the size of an almond, volcanic and pitted. Ymerburgal, he said, spreading the sketch. Americans called it the Ymerburgal pocket. Marines called it worse. We call the whole island Polileu. The map says small, the body says large. He traced the ridgeline's spines with a nail. Caves locked to caves, vents like gills, fields of fire that braided rather than crossed. We built a honeycomb of stubbornness. If you were writing a manual on how to break Marines, you would design Polileu. Nakamura wasn't there either. His unit had bled on Bougainville. But his regiment received survivors transferred from Polileu, men whose shoulders had the rounded look of coral worn by waves. They carried with them a rumor that turned dread into respect. The rumor was this, he said: the Marines should have faltered and did not. The landing beaches at Polileu forced everything that punished Marines onto one page. Zero shade, heat in the 40s, white-hot coral that erased footprints into blisters, water that ran out just when the flame tanks needed it most. Japanese defenses were evolved. No longer wasteful bonsai, but interlocking strongpoints, withdrawal routes, reverse slopes, delay by design. The Marines answered not with romance, but with grind. If Tarawa was a storm, Polileu was a file slowly removing metal. That they kept filing was the message. Why keep hating such men? Nakamura asked, answering himself. Because the mind prefers a decisive blow. It knows where to put glory. A slow method tells you the gods have left, and procedures run the world. He lifted the little volcanic rock. Then came Iwo Jima. He had carried that pebble in his pocket for 20 years. A friend had posted it from a beach that smelled of sulfur and triangles of grief. On Iwo, the Japanese garrison, cunning, disciplined, led by Kurabayashi, who forbade wasteful charges, became the perfect exam for everything the Marine Corps claimed about itself. Kurabayashi changed the question, Nakamura said. No bold defense at the beach. Let them come ashore. Let them own the black sand. Then bury them in arithmetic. Interlocking caves, artillery perfectly registered, unseen mouths of guns. Night raids like surgical cuts instead of drunken charges. He wanted to make the Marines pay in hours, not in yards. The Marines adapted again, because that is what terrified their enemies the most. Their brain was not in one man, but in a culture. Seabees turned that soup of sand into roads under fire. Shore parties sorted a living ant-hill of crates. Naval gunfire pounded MT Suribachi into a drum you could hear in Tokyo. When flamethrowers met volcanic rock, the Marines invented new angles for the nozzle, new tactics for the tanks. When hidden guns chewed up one battalion, the next learned the lesson before noon. Propaganda on both sides had promised monsters. What arrived were men who tolerated fear and stayed organized anyway. On the 5th day, a flag went up on Suribachi and traveled the world. Nakamura snorted gently. Flags are for newspapers, he said. The fight was the network of caves on the north end, where maps lied from exhaustion. That was where we learned the final reason. He placed the pebble dead center on the sketch, as if crowning a hill. The final reason was fraternity. He saw I didn't understand. He leaned closer. Americans like to call it esprit. We had it too. Samurai codes, school ties, regimental colors. Our identity was deep as blood. But on Iwo, we watched squads of Marines do something curious. When a man fell, his friends did not pause to eulogize. They finished the job that minute because he fell. Their grief was converted into algebra. More ammunition forward, more pressure on the cave. That ability to cash grief into momentum is frightening to fight. We sometimes equated it with cruelty. It wasn't. It was a promise kept under fire. He paused, embarrassed by the tenderness and the memory of enemies. Also, he added, they were funny. It sounds silly, but a man who can joke between incoming shells is algebra you cannot solve. Nakamura dabbed at the condensation ring with a napkin, turned it into a compass rose. There were other reasons. The Marines brought language with them that we could not break. Navajo code talkers whose syllables ran like water over stones. We learned to hate those invisible voices because they meant artillery would not be late. We hated bulldozers that behaved like domesticated elephants. We hated that a sergeant could redirect naval gunfire by radio without asking 6 higher headquarters for permission. We hated that after taking one hill, instead of planting a flag and posing, they immediately started planning how to take the next hill without losing so many friends. He sighed. We hated them for being practical in a place that felt mythic to us. I asked him the question that always waits in such conversations. Wasn't the U.S. Army just as formidable? He nodded vigorously. Of course, he said. On Luzon, they were a landslide with supply columns like rivers you could never dam. They could be brilliant tactically and kind to civilians in a way we had forgotten how to be. But the Marines specialized in first contact. They were the point of the spear against Coral and doctrine. Their indoctrination told them they were the point even when they were the shaft or the hand. That belief, grounded by training, inflated by legend, made them aggressive in the first 5 minutes of every landing. And first minutes often decide the last day. He told me a story culled from a veteran's mouth on a ferry between islands. At Saipan, a Marine corporal had his fire team pinned by a machine gun whose bullets wrote curses on a shattered tree. The corporal crawled behind a wrecked Japanese tank, tied 2 smoke grenades together, rolled them toward the gun's slit at the exact moment a dive bomber screamed overhead. In the smoke and noise, his barman slipped to a new angle and drilled the embrasure. The corporal later said he did not plan it. He stacked habits. That stacking, the accretion of small aggressions, was the Marine's art. Nakamura leaned back, exhausted by the past. We hated fighting that, he admitted, because it denied narrative. We wanted honor to be a duel. They made a checklist, and the checklist won. But the story didn't end in hate. In 1955, he'd visited a cemetery on Saipan and, stumbling among crosses and kanji, met a gray-haired man tracing a name cut into stone. The American's hand shook the same way Nakamura sometimes did when he lit a match. They nodded. Neither offered an apology. Both offered a silence big enough to fit the sea. Do you still carry the pebble? I asked. He rolled it in his palm. Ido, not as a trophy, as an anchor. When people speak loudly about glory, I let my fingers feel the holes in the rock. Glory is a poor plaster for those holes. Method fills them. Mercy fills them. Peace fills them better. He looked at the door as if expecting someone he owed money to, and then back at me. You wanted a thesis, he said. Here is mine. The Japanese dreaded fighting Marines because the Corps married myth to method, and method does not tire. Tanks and planes can be matched. Poetry can be answered with poetry. But a culture of small decisions, rehearsed landings, decentralized squads, radios that knit ships to foxholes, logistics that laugh at weather, and a humor to carry it. This is a machine that looks like a family, and a family is hard to kill. We left the coffee house together. Outside, the street vendors were packing away steamers. A stall down the lane sold seashells varnished to unnatural shine. The sky was the gray of an old photograph. Nakamura pressed the pebble into my hand. Keep it, he said. I can't. You can, he insisted. Someday you will hear a young man talk about war as if it were a sport. Put this in his palm and ask him to count the holes. He bowed, the pebble warm from his hand, heating my own. As he walked away, I turned the stone under my thumb. I understood then that hate had been a useful word in the dark to make fear stand still. But in daylight, a better word remained, respect, and behind that, one more, warning. We remember why the Marines were feared not to cosplay their ferocity, but to fear any future that asks men to prove it again. On the train home, I thought of the tide he described. Tides do not roar, they insist. They consult the moon and the shelf of the seabed and arrive when they mean to. On certain beaches in the Pacific, the tide still works at a patient problem, smoothing shells, gentling glass, forgiving footprints. In such work, there's a lesson that outlives uniforms. Method without mercy is a storm. Mercy without method is a wish. The men who terrified Sergeant Nakamura were lethal in method. The world he hoped for needed us to be fluent in mercy. I closed my hand around the pebble. It fit like an oath.